"Don't touch me, you stupid waitress." The words landed harder than the crystal water glass that trembled in Naomi Brooks's steady hand. They sliced through the soft piano music, the quiet conversations, and the polished confidence that filled the grand ballroom of the Monarch Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago. For one impossible heartbeat, every executive stopped talking. Every server froze in place. Even the photographers lowered their cameras as silence settled over the room like fresh snow. At the center of it all stood Charles Drake, a 39-year-old billionaire CEO whose company had transformed artificial intelligence into one of the fastest-growing businesses in America. His tailored navy suit fit like armor. His polished shoes reflected the golden chandeliers overhead. Confidence followed him the way perfume follows expensive cologne. Across from him stood Naomi Brooks, a 26-year-old black waitress whose pressed uniform, simple name tag, and calm expression made her almost invisible to the guests surrounding her. Almost. She hadn't spilled the sparkling water. She hadn't interrupted the conversation. She had simply reached across the table to replace an empty glass before Charles stepped backward without looking. A few drops landed on the sleeve of his custom jacket, no larger than a silver dollar, but to Charles, it was enough to become an offense. He stared at the damp fabric with visible annoyance before lifting his eyes toward Naomi, as though she had personally ruined the most important evening of his life. "People like you should learn to stay out of the way," he said loudly, making no effort to hide his frustration. A few uncomfortable chuckles escaped nearby guests, not because the remark was funny, but because powerful people often make ordinary people forget how to react. Naomi didn't answer. She simply looked at him with steady eyes that revealed neither anger nor embarrassment. She quietly offered a fresh linen napkin, but Charles ignored it. Tonight was supposed to be his greatest triumph. In less than 30 minutes, investors from New York, Dallas, San Francisco, and Boston were expected to finalize a historic $3.5 billion acquisition that would place Drake Quantum Technologies among the most valuable companies in America. Financial reporters waited outside. Television crews prepared live broadcasts. Industry leaders whispered that Charles Drake was about to become the youngest CEO to close a deal of that size before turning 40. Everything about the evening had been designed to celebrate victory. The imported flowers, the live orchestra, the custom menu prepared by an award-winning chef. Every detail reflected power. Every smile reflected opportunity. And yet, hidden beneath polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers, something else had quietly entered the room. Something no investor had noticed. Something no attorney had questioned. Something only one person had seen. Naomi lowered her eyes for only a moment, not in submission, but in thought. Resting beside Charles's leather portfolio was a single document she had recognized while serving the table only minutes earlier. She had read enough to know one signature, one overlooked paragraph, and one impossible detail could destroy everything this room believed was already won. Charles still believed the waitress standing before him was the smallest person in the ballroom. Within minutes, he would discover she was the only person capable of changing the future of everyone inside it. The ballroom slowly came back to life, but the rhythm had changed. Conversations returned in cautious whispers instead of confident laughter. Crystal glasses clinked softly beneath the glow of towering chandeliers, and the jazz trio resumed its elegant melody as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet something invisible lingered in the air, a tension too subtle to explain and too heavy to ignore. Charles Drake brushed the last drop of water from his sleeve with obvious irritation before straightening his cufflinks. He hated imperfections, especially on nights like this. Every detail mattered. Every photograph would be published tomorrow. Every handshake would become part of financial history. Failure was never part of his vocabulary. Around the oval mahogany table sat some of the most influential names in American business. Venture capital partners from Silicon Valley exchanged quiet remarks with hedge fund managers from New York. Corporate attorneys reviewed thick binders filled with contracts worth more than entire companies. The atmosphere carried the unmistakable scent of ambition, expensive coffee, polished leather, and fresh white roses arranged perfectly down the center of the room. Tonight was more than a celebration. It was a public declaration that Drake Quantum Technologies had become untouchable. Charles welcomed the attention. He had spent 15 years building his empire one acquisition at a time, earning a reputation for closing impossible negotiations with calm precision and relentless confidence. Business magazines called him fearless. Financial television called him visionary. His employees often called him demanding, although never to his face. He believed success belonged only to people willing to expect perfection from everyone around them. That belief extended to everyone in the room, especially those wearing uniforms. Across the ballroom, Naomi Brooks continued serving guests with the same quiet professionalism she had displayed since the evening began. She refilled coffee cups, collected empty plates, and answered polite requests with a warm smile that never appeared forced. To most of the guests, she blended naturally into the background, another member of the hospitality staff whose presence was noticed only when someone needed something. Naomi preferred it that way. Invisible people often heard conversations others believed were private. They noticed details powerful people overlooked. They watched without being watched. As she approached another table carrying a silver tray, her eyes drifted back toward the leather portfolio resting beside Charles. Earlier, while replacing a coffee cup, she had noticed a familiar company logo printed across one attachment tucked beneath the acquisition agreement. The symbol belonged to a consulting firm where she had once completed an internship before family responsibilities forced her to leave graduate school. During those months, she had reviewed enough compliance documents to recognize one rule. Every corporate attorney feared violating. At first, she questioned her own memory. Perhaps she had only caught a brief glimpse. Perhaps exhaustion after a double shift had fooled her. But the more she replayed the image in her mind, the more certain she became that one supporting document referenced an outdated regulatory certification that had expired months earlier. If she was correct, the entire acquisition could become legally vulnerable before the ink even dried. Naomi slowed her pace, carefully balancing the tray while silently debating whether to trust her instincts. She had no invitation to speak, no title, no authority, only a memory she wished she could ignore. Meanwhile, Charles leaned confidently toward the lead investor, smiling as cameras prepared outside the ballroom doors. In his mind, the hardest part of the evening was already over. He had absolutely no idea that the greatest threat to his $3.5 billion deal was not sitting beside the attorneys or across from the investors. She was quietly carrying dessert plates only a few feet away. Naomi carried the dessert tray through the ballroom with the same measured pace she had practiced for years, but her thoughts were moving much faster than her footsteps. The polished marble floor reflected the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, while conversations about stock prices, innovation, and market expansion floated through the air like background music. She had learned long ago that wealthy people often revealed their most important secrets when they believed no one was listening. Tonight was proving no different. As she placed a slice of flourless chocolate cake before one of the investors, she heard fragments of the conversation surrounding Charles Drake. They spoke with complete confidence about closing documents, regulatory approval, media announcements, and tomorrow morning's opening bell on Wall Street. Every sentence assumed the deal was already finished. Every smile reflected certainty. Naomi quietly stepped away, but the image of that document remained fixed in her mind. During her internship 2 years earlier at Harrison & Cole Compliance Group, she had spent hundreds of hours reviewing acquisition paperwork for senior analysts. It had not been glamorous work. Most interns complained about endless binders and legal checklists. Naomi never did. She had treated every file as though someone's future depended on it because sometimes it actually did. Her supervisor had once told her that billion-dollar deals rarely collapsed because of dramatic mistakes. They collapsed because one overlooked document quietly invalidated everything else. That lesson had stayed with her long after financial hardship forced her to leave graduate school and take a full-time job supporting her younger brother after their mother's unexpected illness. Life had changed her career, but it had never erased what she had learned. She reached the service station near the ballroom entrance and carefully placed the empty tray beside the coffee machine. Another server noticed the thoughtful expression on her face. "Everything all right?" he asked softly. Naomi offered a polite smile. "Just thinking." It was the truth, although not the whole truth. She was thinking about responsibility. She was thinking about whether remaining silent would protect her job or destroy someone else's future. Across the room, Charles stood beside a massive digital display showing the logos of both companies soon to become one. Investors congratulated him before the papers had even been signed. Television producers adjusted lighting outside the ballroom, preparing for live interviews. A hotel manager quietly reminded the service staff that no interruptions would be tolerated once the signing ceremony began. Every employee nodded. Naomi nodded too, but her attention remained fixed on the portfolio resting beside Charles's chair. She remembered the exact placement of the attachment. A compliance certificate tucked behind the executive summary. A date printed near the bottom corner. A corporate seal she recognized immediately. If her memory was correct, that certification had expired nearly 6 months earlier after new federal reporting requirements had taken effect. Any experienced compliance officer should have caught it. Yet somehow it had reached the final signing table untouched. Naomi questioned herself again. Perhaps she had mistaken one document for another. Perhaps stress was filling in details that were never there. She closed her eyes for a brief moment and replayed everything she had seen. The logo, the expiration line, the signature block, the formatting. Each memory returned with startling clarity. Her confidence grew stronger instead of weaker. She opened her eyes just as one of Charles's attorneys announced that the final review was complete and all parties were ready to proceed. Applause spread across the ballroom. Guests raised their glasses. Cameras outside prepared to enter. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken, not because she feared speaking, but because she understood the cost of saying nothing. Within moments, history would either be celebrated or rewritten, and somehow the decision rested with the one person everyone in that magnificent room had already decided did not matter. Charles Drake accepted another round of congratulations with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the future had already signed his name. He shook hands, smiled for photographs, and exchanged polished remarks with investors who had spent months competing for a seat at his table. Success had become so familiar that it no longer surprised him. It simply arrived on schedule, just as he expected. 15 years earlier, Charles had launched Drake Quantum Technologies from a small office outside Chicago with little more than a bold idea and relentless discipline. He had worked longer hours than anyone around him, negotiated contracts others considered impossible, and transformed setbacks into stepping stones. The business world admired his intelligence almost as much as it feared his determination. Employees often described him as brilliant, demanding, and emotionally distant. Charles considered those compliments. He believed business rewarded results, not feelings. In his mind, respect was earned through influence, measured by revenue, and protected by authority. The larger his company became, the narrower his world grew. Meetings replaced conversations. Performance replaced compassion. Titles mattered. Status mattered. Outcomes mattered. Everything else became background noise, including the people who quietly kept that world running. Hotel staff, drivers, receptionists, janitors, and servers existed in the edges of his vision like furniture that simply belonged there. He never considered himself cruel. He simply believed everyone occupied the place they deserved. If someone wanted more, they should work harder. It was a philosophy he repeated during leadership conferences and magazine interviews, where audiences applauded his confidence without seeing the invisible cost behind it. Tonight, that certainty surrounded him like an expensive tailored suit. The ballroom reflected his success in every polished surface. Massive windows overlooked the Chicago skyline, glowing beneath the evening sky. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across marble floors. Investors laughed comfortably over glasses of sparkling water, while financial analysts quietly discussed tomorrow's headlines. Charles imagined those headlines already. Visionary leader closes historic acquisition. American innovation reaches new heights. Drake Quantum changes the industry forever. He had rehearsed the interviews, prepared the statements, and memorized every number. $3.5 billion. Thousands of future jobs. Expanded research facilities. International growth. It was supposed to become the defining achievement of his career. Across the room, Naomi continued moving gracefully between tables, nearly invisible once again. Charles barely noticed her as she collected empty glasses from nearby guests. In his mind, she had already disappeared the moment their uncomfortable exchange ended. He never questioned whether his words had been unfair, because fairness rarely entered his calculations. Efficiency did. Control did. Winning always did. His lead attorney stepped forward carrying the leather portfolio and placed it carefully before him. Everything has been reviewed, the attorney said confidently. All documents are ready for signatures. Charles nodded without hesitation. He trusted experts to handle details beneath his attention. That was why he hired the best lawyers, the best consultants, and the best compliance team's money. Goodbye. Mistakes belong to other companies, not his. Around the ballroom, photographers quietly entered through the main doors while television crews positioned cameras near the signing table. The atmosphere shifted from private negotiation to public celebration. Every guest instinctively turned toward the center of the room. Every conversation faded into anticipation. Charles picked up the polished silver pen prepared specifically for the ceremony and smiled toward the investors seated across from him. The future seemed only one signature away. Yet only a few steps behind the cameras, Naomi stood perfectly still, watching the portfolio with growing certainty. She no longer questioned what she had seen. She questioned only whether anyone powerful enough would be willing to hear the truth from someone they had already decided was too insignificant to matter. The applause faded as the master of ceremonies invited everyone to gather closer for the official signing. Camera operators adjusted their angles. Reporters whispered final notes into their microphones. The lead investors exchanged confident smiles, already discussing the press conference that would follow. A pair of hotel attendants quietly opened the double doors leading to the ballroom entrance, allowing several late-arriving financial journalists to slip inside. Every movement felt carefully choreographed, every second leading toward what everyone believed would become one of the year's biggest corporate headlines. Naomi remained near the service station, her hands resting lightly against the polished silver tray she no longer noticed. Her attention never left the portfolio on the signing table. The memory of the compliance certificate had become impossible to dismiss. She replayed every detail again, not searching for reasons to speak, but searching for reasons to remain silent. She found none. If she was wrong, she would likely lose her job. If she was right, thousands of employees, shareholders, and investors could face consequences no one in the room yet understood. Responsibility weighed far more than fear. Across the ballroom, Charles accepted the ceremonial pen from his attorney before, casually glancing around the room. His eyes landed briefly on Naomi again. She was standing still instead of serving guests. The sight immediately irritated him. To Charles, efficiency reflected professionalism, and anyone standing motionless during an event of this scale appeared incompetent. He gestured impatiently toward a nearby empty table where several glasses still waited to be collected. Naomi understood the gesture, but did not move. Her hesitation lasted only a second, yet it caught Charles's attention. His expression hardened. "Is there a reason you are standing there?" he asked loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. The room became noticeably quieter. Naomi answered with calm respect. "Sir, I believe there may be an issue that deserves attention before the documents are signed." Charles let out a short laugh that carried more disbelief than amusement. Several executives exchanged awkward glances. One investor raised an eyebrow. Charles stepped closer, lowering his voice only slightly, although everyone nearby could still hear every word. "You believe there is an issue with a transaction negotiated by the best attorneys in the country?" Naomi kept her posture steady. "I may be mistaken, but I think one compliance document should be reviewed one more time." Charles smiled with visible impatience. That is exactly why billion-dollar acquisitions are handled by professionals instead of people carrying dessert trays. A few uncomfortable laughs spread through the crowd before fading almost immediately. No one appeared genuinely entertained. Even those smiling seemed uncertain whether they should continue. Naomi did not react to the remark. She neither defended herself nor challenged him. She simply looked toward the leather portfolio once more. Her silence unsettled more people than an argument would have. The lead investor, Richard Holloway, noticed it too. After 3 decades in private equity, he had learned that confidence often spoke loudly, while truth usually arrived quietly. He watched Naomi carefully, searching her face for uncertainty. Instead, he found composure. There was no panic in her eyes, no anger, no desire to embarrass anyone. Only the unmistakable expression of someone carrying information she wished she did not have to deliver. Richard slowly turned toward Charles. "It would take less than a minute to hear what she has to say," he said evenly. The ballroom fell completely silent. Charles tightened his grip on the silver pen. For the first time that evening, the ceremony paused. Not because of a board member, not because of an attorney, and not because of an investor, but because a waitress everyone had overlooked had quietly refused to ignore what everyone else had failed to see. Richard Holloway's quiet suggestion lingered in the air for several long seconds. No one reached for a document. No one spoke. The orchestra had stopped playing without anyone asking. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, sensing that something unexpected had interrupted the carefully planned celebration. Charles Drake slowly turned toward Richard, forcing a polite smile that barely concealed his frustration. "Richard, we have spent 8 months conducting due diligence," he said evenly. 3 law firms, 2 accounting firms, and an entire compliance division have reviewed every page. I think we are beyond taking legal advice from hotel staff. Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked back at Naomi. "I did not ask whether she was qualified," he replied calmly. "I asked whether we could spare 60 seconds to hear her." The room remained silent. Charles exhaled through his nose before giving a brief, dismissive wave with one hand. "Fine. 60 seconds." Every eye shifted toward Naomi. She stepped forward with measured confidence, stopping several feet from the signing table. She did not reach for the portfolio. She did not touch a single page. Instead, she looked directly at the lead attorney. "May I ask one question?" The attorney nodded cautiously. Naomi spoke clearly enough for everyone in the ballroom to hear. "Does the compliance package still rely on the Harrison and Cole certification issued before the federal reporting update that became effective earlier this year?" The attorney blinked once. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Charles frowned, noticing it. Immediately, Naomi continued without raising her voice. "If that certification has not been replaced with the revised filing, Section 12 of the acquisition agreement may reference documentation that is no longer valid for regulatory approval." She stopped speaking. Nothing more. No dramatic speech. No accusation. Only a single observation delivered with remarkable composure. For a moment, absolutely nothing happened. Then the lead attorney opened the portfolio. His fingers moved with new urgency as he separated the documents one by one. Another attorney leaned closer. A third attorney stood from his chair and walked around the table to look over the file himself. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier quietly dissolved. Charles watched them with growing impatience. "Well," he asked. No one answered. Pages turned faster. The attorneys whispered to one another, their voices too low for the guests to hear. One of them reached for a laptop, while another requested the digital compliance files from an assistant standing near the back wall. Richard Holloway folded his hands without saying a word. He had seen negotiations change direction before, but never because of a single sentence from someone who had not even been invited to the meeting. Naomi remained exactly where she stood. She offered no explanation and made no attempt to defend herself. Her eyes stayed on the attorneys, not on Charles. She understood that the documents would either confirm her memory or prove she had been mistaken. Within less than a minute, the lead attorney's face lost its color. He looked toward Charles with an expression no successful chief executive ever wanted to see from legal counsel. "Mr. Drake," he said carefully, "we need to pause the signing immediately." Every conversation in the ballroom disappeared. Camera operators instinctively pointed their lenses toward the table. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. Charles slowly lowered the silver pen onto the polished wood, his confidence giving way to confusion for the very first time that evening. The celebration had not ended with an argument or a scandal. It had stopped because one quiet woman had spoken. Exactly one truth at exactly the right moment. The lead attorney carefully removed the questioned certification from the portfolio and laid it beside the acquisition agreement. Another attorney opened the digital compliance database on a laptop, while a third began comparing document numbers one by one. The confidence that had filled the ballroom only minutes earlier disappeared beneath the quiet tapping of keyboards and the soft rustle of turning pages. Investors who had been smiling moments before now leaned forward in complete silence, watching every movement with growing concern. Charles Drake remained standing beside the signing table, refusing to believe that the evening could possibly be changing because of a single observation from someone he had dismissed without a second thought. "There has to be some misunderstanding," he said. keeping his voice controlled even as impatience crept into every word. "Verify it, and let us continue." No one answered immediately. The attorneys continued reviewing the files with complete concentration. Finally, the youngest associate looked toward the lead counsel before quietly rotating the laptop screen. The expiration date displayed on the compliance record matched exactly what Naomi had remembered. More troubling still, the updated certification had never been attached to the final acquisition package. The lead attorney closed his eyes for a brief moment before speaking. The previous certification expired 5 months ago after the new federal reporting standards became mandatory. The replacement filing exists in our internal records, but it was never incorporated into the final execution package. Richard Holloway slowly leaned back in his chair. "What does that mean?" he asked. The attorney answered with careful precision. "If these documents are signed in their current form, the transaction could immediately face regulatory challenges. At minimum, closing would be delayed until every compliance reference is corrected and independently verified." Another investor spoke before anyone else could react. "How long would that take?" The attorneys exchanged uncertain glances. "Several weeks, possibly longer, depending on the review." A wave of quiet conversation spread across the ballroom. Financial analysts whispered into their phones. Reporters lowered their voices while sending urgent messages to editors waiting outside. Camera operators, sensing history unfolding in an entirely different direction, kept their lenses fixed on the signing table instead of the celebration backdrop. Charles looked from one attorney to another, searching for someone willing to dismiss the problem as minor. No one did. Every face reflected the same uncomfortable realization. Naomi had been correct. Richard turned his attention toward Naomi with genuine curiosity. "How did you recognize it?" he asked. Naomi answered simply, "I interned for Harrison and Cole before I began working here. We studied those reporting updates extensively because every acquisition after the regulation changed required revised certifications. The formatting on the attachment caught my attention while I was serving your table." Her explanation contained no pride, no attempt to impress anyone, only a straightforward account of what she had seen. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. For the first time that evening, they were no longer seeing a waitress in a hotel uniform. They were seeing someone whose knowledge had just protected every person in the room from signing documents that should never have reached the table. Charles felt every confident assumption he had carried into the ballroom begin to collapse beneath the weight of one undeniable truth. He had trusted resumes, titles, and reputations without question, yet ignored the only voice that had actually prevented a costly mistake. The room that had once echoed with admiration for his leadership now waited silently for his next words. But for perhaps the first time in his career, Charles Drake discovered that confidence alone could not answer the truth, standing quietly a few feet away. No one rushed toward the signing table anymore. The excitement that had filled the ballroom only minutes earlier had been replaced by careful conversations and measured expressions. Investors who had expected to celebrate now gathered in small circles with attorneys, quietly, discussing timelines, regulatory exposure, and the difficult decisions that suddenly lay ahead. The enormous digital display behind the stage still showed the logos of both companies side by side, but its message no longer represented certainty. It represented a future that had just become uncertain. Charles Drake stood motionless beside the untouched signature page. The silver pen remained exactly where he had placed it, no longer a symbol of victory, but of hesitation. For years he had built his reputation on making fast decisions with unwavering confidence. Tonight, however, every instinct urged patience. The lead attorney approached him again with several revised notes. "We cannot recommend moving forward," he said. "Even if the updated certification exists internally, every supporting reference must be corrected before any signature is placed on these documents. The safest course is to postpone the closing." Charles slowly nodded. There was no argument left to make. Richard Holloway looked around the room before addressing the other investors. "Then we postpone the transaction until every document satisfies the required standards." One by one, the remaining investors agreed. No one appeared angry. They appeared relieved. The realization spread quickly through the ballroom. What had seemed like a devastating interruption had almost certainly prevented a far more expensive problem later. Reporters waiting outside received updated statements within minutes. Instead of announcing a completed acquisition, news alerts described an unexpected delay caused by a final compliance review. Financial commentators immediately began speculating about the reasons behind the postponement, unaware that the turning point had begun with one quiet observation from someone whose name was absent from every corporate program distributed that evening. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere softened. Executives who had barely noticed Naomi earlier now looked toward her with genuine curiosity. Several quietly thanked her as they walked past. Others simply offered respectful nods. She accepted each gesture with the same calm humility she had shown throughout the evening. She never suggested that she had saved the deal. She only believed she had fulfilled a responsibility that her conscience would not allow her to ignore. Charles watched those moments unfold with growing discomfort. The words he had spoken to Naomi earlier echoed far louder in his mind than they ever had in the ballroom. For the first time in many years, he questioned not a business strategy, not a financial projection, but his own judgment of another human being. He replayed every impatient remark, every dismissive assumption, every moment he had decided that a uniform defined a person's value. None of those assumptions had survived the evening. Richard quietly walked over to Naomi before preparing to leave. "You probably protected every person in this room," he said sincerely. Naomi offered a small smile. "I only hoped someone would verify what I remembered." Richard nodded. "That is exactly what professionals do." As guests slowly departed beneath the warm lights of the grand ballroom, the celebration everyone had planned quietly transformed into something far more meaningful. A historic acquisition had been delayed, but an even more important truth had emerged. Titles could command attention. Wealth could command influence. Reputation could command headlines. Yet none of those could replace integrity, careful observation, and the courage to speak with respect when remaining silent would have been easier. The ballroom had nearly emptied by the time Charles Drake finally found Naomi returning folded linens to the service station near the kitchen entrance. The cameras were gone. The reporters had left. The investors had driven back to their hotels to prepare for another day of negotiations. The celebration that had been planned for months had ended not with applause, but with quiet reflection. Naomi continued organizing glassware with the same care she had shown throughout the evening, never expecting anyone to approach her again. She looked up only when she heard measured footsteps stop beside her. Charles stood silently for several seconds before speaking. The confidence that had defined him all night had been replaced by something unfamiliar. Humility. "Miss Brooks," he said softly, "I owe you an apology." Naomi listened without interrupting. "I judged you before I knew anything about you," Charles continued. "I assumed your uniform defined your ability. I spoke to you with disrespect, and I was completely wrong." Naomi answered with the same calm voice that had carried her through the evening. "Everyone makes assumptions. What matters is what we choose after we recognize them." Charles lowered his eyes for a brief moment. He had negotiated with presidents, challenged billion-dollar competitors, and spoken before thousands of business leaders. Yet those few words carried more weight than any boardroom speech he had ever heard. "You protected my company tonight," he said. Naomi gently shook her head. "I protected the truth. It belonged to everyone in that room." The simplicity of her answer stayed with him. She never asked for recognition. She never mentioned a reward. She never reminded him that he had embarrassed her in front of an entire ballroom. She simply returned to her work because integrity had never depended on being noticed. A few days later, every compliance issue had been corrected, every document had been independently verified, and the acquisition successfully closed under full regulatory approval. The investors praised the legal team's careful review, but those who had attended the original ceremony quietly remembered where the turning point had truly begun. Richard Holloway made certain that memory was not forgotten. During the first board meeting after the transaction closed, he publicly recognized Naomi's integrity and attention to detail. Charles stood before the room and acknowledged that the most important lesson of the entire acquisition had not come from a consultant, an executive, or an attorney. It had come from someone he had failed to respect. Months later, Drake Quantum Technologies created a scholarship supporting students whose education had been interrupted by financial hardship, inspired by Naomi's story and her unfinished graduate studies. When Charles invited her to help develop the program, She accepted only after insisting that the scholarship focus on opportunity rather than charity. She wanted students to be recognized for their potential, not their circumstances. The program eventually helped hundreds of young people continue their education, many of whom had once believed their dreams had quietly ended. Charles often shared one lesson during leadership conferences after that night. He no longer spoke only about innovation, growth, or market strategy. Instead, he reminded audiences that the smartest voice in the room might not be sitting at the conference table. It might be standing quietly in the background, waiting for someone to listen. Wealth can open doors. Power can command attention. Success can fill headlines. But none of them can replace humility, character, or the wisdom to recognize another person's worth before life forces that lesson upon us. On the night, everyone expected billions of dollars to define history. It was dignity that became the greatest victory of all.